Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another catalog in brief. Alright, so this video's had a bit of an interesting life in development. The spark for me to make this video started when I came across a project this guy just put out this past April called Meditations by chance while Bandcamp diving, and I thought, hey, that'd probably be something cool to stick into some Stuff I Miss segment. I'd known about this guy in passing for ages now and figured he was someone I should know more about than I did. However, as I started researching this guy, it became abundantly clear that relegating him to a Some Stuff I Miss segment for my first time covering him probably wasn't going to cut it. He was going to need a proper video with a full and brief segment to do him justice. And for a while this was going to be a review of Meditations with an in brief segment, but while I think Meditations technically could have given me enough to break down for a slightly lengthier review at the end, the longer I spent writing the video and the longer the in brief segment got, the more it became clear to me, actually, you know what, this is better just served as a standalone in brief video like those other ones I've been doing recently. Wasn't technically part of my plans for this format, but I figured the guy deserved a video of this scale, so here we go. Today, we're talking about Carl Craig. This guy is one of the more legendary names to come out of the 90s Detroit Techno scene. He's well known as a DJ and remixer. He's done remixes for God knows how many hundreds of bands and artists at this point, anywhere from Block Party to The Avalanches to Depeche Mode to The Orb and System 7 to assisting Derek May on a remix for a guy called Gerald and countless other examples. But he's also well known as the founder of the record label Planet E Communications, a label that's since taken on something of a life of its own, having been the host to high-profile projects from artists like Moody Man and Kevin Saunderson, among lots of others, as well as being the first record label ever to get a Discogs page. But he's also, of course, very well known for his own original music. While his own discography is extremely scattered over several different aliases and not the easiest to navigate, he has put out plenty of super well-acclaimed classics. This is a guy who commands lots of respect in the scene I'm most immersed in. There's even apparently an entire documentary about his life that was released recently that I have not watched. And somehow I'd never gotten around to actually diving into his work more in depth before now, so better late than never, I guess. So I went down and tracked down as many full-length studio albums or album-length compilations entirely of the guy's own work as I could reasonably find, either on his own or sometimes in collaboration with other artists. Now, for the sake of brevity, this video is obviously not 100% comprehensive to everything his name has been attached to. I've obviously skipped over the hundreds of remixes or his various DJ mix projects he's released over the years. I also did not include some projects he was like a co-producer for on the side but not the lead artist on, such as the Detroit Experiments in 2003, which he worked on with Aaron Levinson and a shit ton of other musicians, or his work as part of the Detroit Techno supergroup Urban Tribe, which released a bunch of albums in their own right, although is primarily helmed by Sherrard Ingram, aka DJ Stingray. I also didn't include the Party/After Party project he released in 2022, which Discogs technically lists as a Carl Craig solo album, but more specifically is a soundtrack to a one-off art installation that happened during the pandemic and ended up being released exclusively on a super limited vinyl pressing, currently available on his Bandcamp page for the low price of €135, with no digital or streaming options anywhere. Needless to say, I did not hear that one. Though exclusions like those aside, hopefully this should at least make for a serviceable enough introduction for those looking to get into Craig's work, and or like me may not have known where to start or what to even look for, so here's my thoughts on most of his discography so far. Alright, to start with, here's a collection of his earliest material, which he put out under the names Psyche and BFC anywhere between 1989 and 1990. I am technically going slightly out of chronological order here, since this particular compilation released in 1996 and the reissue I'm showing the cover of here came out in 2013. But considering the material actually included here is the oldest of the material I'll be talking about, I put it here first. Anyway, the material on this comp shows him building off the late 80s techno and electro traditions to set down the kinds of styles and frameworks that shortly afterwards would evolve into ambient techno and, like, Warp Records, Artificial Intelligence IDM. Like early Aphex Twin type stuff before Aphex Twin got the chance to actually release anything of his own. And that sound is already pretty well formed, with tracks such as Elements, Neurotic Behavior, and Chicken Noodle Soup surrounding you with lots of smooth and mildly cinematic melodic pads next to classic 808 drum machine structures. There's a decent amount of variety too, some tracks that bring in breakbeats like Please Stand By and D-Funk. There's some tracks which get much more minimal and stripped back like Galaxy or It's a Shame that feel like being lost in a cloud of haze. There's also some drier moments here and there, and some standard electro-style tracks that didn't really grab my attention. But needless to say, this material is pretty dang ahead of its time, and there's more than enough gems to make the whole thing still easily hold up. Next up in the early 90s, this was when he started up the Planet E label, and among the first releases for said label was a series of EPs he released under the name 6ix9ine. Just the number 6ix9ine, no weird spelling gimmicks, thank you. All the EPs he released under the name from 1991 to 1994, as well as an extra EP he put out under the name way later in 2006, are all collected together in this compilation, which came out in 2009. Now, considering the totality of all this material adds up to an experience that stretches on for over 2 hours and maybe runs together a bit, this comp is probably best designed as something you can pick and choose favorites from rather than benefiting from listening to everything all in one go. But at the same time, the level of quality you're getting across the board is pretty consistent. You're just getting a lot of minimal house, filter house, and techno bangers that all kind of wind around at the same pace and hit on roughly the same level. Probably got some early industrial influence in there too, given the first EP was called 4 Jazz Funk Classics as a nod to Throbbing Gristle. The stuff from the Light Music EP in particular probably pulled me in the most effectively. My Machines, Jam the Box, Desire, and Micro Lover are all great tracks, but I also quite like the tracks Ladies and Gentlemen, Pung Tang, and Poi et Pa. Maybe 3 different versions of the latter track included here was a bit overkill, but whatever, compilation problems. If you want a more compact collection of his material under the name, there was also a CD exclusive comp in 1996 called The Sound of Music, though I opted to mention this later comp instead, since it's not only a much more actually complete collection of the material he released under this name, but also much easier to find on all the streaming services. In any case, plenty of classic stuff here to be sure. But that takes us to his debut project under his real name from 1995, probably his most well-known and well-acclaimed work overall. And yeah, it is really cool, as you'd expect. It sticks pretty closely to well-established techno formulas from the time, but he does provide his own unique and semi-recognizable spin on it that feels like a cross between those nascent ambient techno and early IDM styles, more traditional Detroit electro styles like what Drexciya were doing at the time, and even some thicker 80s-inspired synth arrangements that feel somewhat predictive of what would end up becoming synthwave decades later, with maybe some later Kraftwerk adjacent flavors like circa Computer World and Electric Cafe, even featuring some neat guitar soloing on a handful of tracks to even further the whole retro-futurist feel. Very easy stuff to get into if you're a fan of any of these styles. And it's handily the best sequenced album of his. It feels like it follows a very loose narrative structure with tracks seeming to communicate ideas between each other. Now, I will say, I was kinda left wanting to love this album even more than I did. I did feel like the experience was kinda samey, and it's not quite as easy to tell the tracks apart from each other here as it was on those compilations I got done talking about. This is the one project where it feels like he is most trying to stick to, like, one particular sonic formula without really diverting from it that much. But he does still have the tunes to back himself up for an experience that's always both melodic and propulsive, and again managing to find enough of his own identity in a fairly crowded techno landscape. So yeah, I would still call this a great album. I can certainly see where the hype comes from in any case. Next up, here's an album he put out in 1996 under the name Paperclip People, collecting together both some various tracks he released as singles through the early 90s and adding in some new stuff as well. The effect of this one feels kinda like, oh, what if that 6ix9ine compilation I talked about earlier was limited to just the very best parts without any filler? And also, what if all the tracks themselves were just better in general? This is just a damn great collection of dance music, from the minimal techno and electro side that still bangs like Oscillator or Paperclip Man, to the more melodic-leaning productions like Clear and Present or My Neighborhood. There's some banging and funky sample-based or even mildly disco-flavored house cuts like Throw, Floor, and Steam. The climax goes more dub techno influenced and switches over into more of a sample-based style partway through. There's a track called Country Boy Goes Dub, which I'll just say lives up to the title and bangs in its own weird way. I guess I could say the sequencing on this project can feel kind of arbitrary at times, and it may not be the kind of listening experience where the tracks are necessarily like directly reinforcing each other into something greater than the sum of their parts. I felt like Landcruising still gave Craig more of a specific recognizable sound and felt more cohesively structured as a whole than this does, but I would say I prefer this album anyway. It's hard to complain too much about that kind of stuff when all the individual tracks themselves are really damn good to great, and the wide variety of styles ensures the listening experience is never boring. This is an excellent project and some of his very best work. But if you want the best of both worlds of those last two projects, an album that both sticks to the recognizable sound and style that Craig could call his own, while also keeping the experience well varied and consistently interesting without ever running together, I think this one stands as Craig's true masterpiece. The retro sci-fi feel he nailed down on Landcruising was done just as well here, leading to lots of strong classic melodic techno tracks like Televised Green Smoke or Atlas, among plenty of others. But he also puts a whole bunch of other twists on the sound, adding house pianos on the epic Butterfly, or cool dramatic harpsichord-like synths on Goodbye World, twisted into off-kilter experimental downtempo on Red Lights, cutting up repeating vocal samples into atmospheric washes on Dominus. The track As Time Goes By brings in some smooth guest vocals from Sarah Gregory, and it's followed by the track Attitude, which is dedicated entirely to a purely a cappella scat performance from Naomi Daniel, which is random, but a cool addition. A lot of different random ideas going into this, but they still all feel well sequenced to come together as a whole. So yeah, don't really have much else to say besides, this lived up to the hype that I had seen thrown in this direction. This is my favorite project I've heard from him. The last album Craig released in the 90s came under the name Innerzone Orchestra and showed him bringing together an entire mini ensemble of live jazz musicians to join his usual downtempo and experimental techno arrangements, including live drums from Francisco Mora, keyboards and pianos from Craig Taborn, bass and some vocals provided by Paul Randolph, several different instruments such as bass and keyboards and other things from an artist simply credited as Blackula, and plenty of others. A lot of times the live performances are presented in such a specific way to make it sound like they could have been more electronically generated than they were, hence the album title. And once again, there's plenty of variety in highlights. There's two hip-hop adjacent cuts at the beginning called Manufactured Memories and The Beginning of the End, the latter featuring a rapper called Laxidaisical. There's extended jazz fusion jams like the 9-minute violin-led Blackula, which has quite the nice payoff in its second half, or the almost 9-minute beatless Basic Math. There's a cool crossover with Richie Houghton called Architecture. There's a bunch of covers of old songs, including a soulful rendition of The Stylistics' People Make the World Go Round, a spacey rendition of Galaxy by War, and a jazzier piano-led retooling of Craig's own track Atlas. And of course, the album ends in a lively edit of the first and most well-known single to have released under the Innerzone Orchestra name, Bug in a Bass Spin. Best known for becoming an unintentional early period drum and bass anthem when DJs such as Fabio and Groove Rider played the track at 45 RPM instead of its originally intended 33 1/3 RPM in their sets, adding it to the early canon of non-hardcore jungle breaks. There's an urban legend that says that track was the progenitor of drum and bass as an entire genre, which I suppose that's not impossible, although I've also seen a number of people try to dispute that story. It is true that the first version of that track came out as the B-side on a relatively rare split single in 1992, before drum and bass as a genre had really been standardized. But the standalone single version that got the most actual notoriety and popularity on the scene came out in 1996, and by that point the genre was pretty well established with plenty of now classic albums. I don't have a direct source to confirm the legend one way or the other, but regardless of whether that's true, the track is already plenty historically important as is, and one of the biggest highlights on this album regardless of context. And programmed as a full album, while less of a home run for me than the Paperclip People album or More Songs About Food and Revolutionary Art, is still really dang good and another quality addition to the guy's catalog. Alright, so now we're officially in the 2000s, and as a bonus I've decided to throw in this EP from 2004 since A, it's pretty well received, and B, it's all original material that doesn't appear anywhere else. This was probably the cleanest production job he's delivered to date. The tracks themselves stick to mostly very straightforward minimal techno frameworks, which were relatively popular at the time. Aside from one track that goes for something more experimental dark ambient. But the tunes are all quite solid. The best one is the mostly beatless opener Twilight. A lot of cool melodic progression on that one, though Sandstorms is a neat minimal techno jam as well. Good stuff. Next up, in 2005, he came back with his next new full-length album under his real name, which was... it was Landcruising again. He made a full-on remake of his debut album, rebuilt from the ground up 10 years later after the fact, in hopes of improving it and removing supposedly dated elements of it, retitled to the album formerly known as, which, well, marginally clever, also fooled some people into thinking this was something completely new and unrelated. Now, personally, I didn't really feel like Landcruising needed a remake in the first place. I thought the original held up great as is, and what minor updates are here are not all for the better. For one thing, the guitar solos all got taken out, which I suppose I could understand why some might consider those dated, but they were one of the aspects of that album sound I found the most interesting, and taking them out made this feel less unique. And more glaringly, the sequencing was completely scrambled around in a way that felt more thoughtless and arbitrary, which feels like a bit of a kick in the teeth to do that for the one Carl Craig album that used to feel like it had the most thought put into the sequencing out of all his work. Nor did the resequencing do anything to address my actual biggest issue with Landcruising being the general sameness. If anything, this slightly exacerbated the issue, considering the expanded length, and especially the two unnecessary beatless versions of tracks tacked on at the end that weren't even entirely beatless. Though, to be clear, I do not think he ruined the experience by any stretch either. This never messed with the core of what made any of these tracks work well, and to be fair, this version is definitely more cleanly produced. Some tracks, like Science Fiction, felt noticeably crisper and more banging than before. All the tracks received minor rearrangements, and the album's shorter tracks, like One Day Soon, were fleshed out a little better too. There's even a new track added on called Sparkle, which is just as good as anything on the original. I've seen people who prefer this version over the 95 version, and I can kinda see where those people are coming from. Might be worth checking out to figure out what you prefer, but on a personal level, I suspect I'll just be sticking to the original. Okay, now this is an interesting one. Fast forward to 2008, where Craig teamed up with Moritz von Oswald of Basic Channel and Maurizio fame to reinterpret the classical works of Maurice Ravel and Modest Mussorgsky. I wasn't sure what to think of this idea when I saw it on paper. Regular traditional classical music tends not to really be my thing, but this is a lot cooler in execution than I thought it was going to sound. I mean, sure, when the project first started, I got treated to ambient synth pads playing the classical chord progression so straightforwardly as to remind me of William Orbit's Pieces in a Modern Style, but the project kept slowly evolving over time with, like, chopped up horns being introduced, then some light beat work and other synth textures, and by the halfway point, all the classical elements were gone and they were just doing a spacey dub techno jam together. The transition so seamless one might not even notice. And, like, the second half also gets pretty interesting, like some more dramatic loops, orchestral elements would come back in to join the techno beats later, and then it ended with a section with all this tropical flavored hand percussion brought in, changing up the meter, which is neat too. This does appear to be something of a divisive one among Craig's fans, but it's definitely one of the more interesting combinations of electronic and classical styles I've heard in quite some time, and one that is clearly much more electronic in mindset than classical. I really liked it, can definitely recommend giving it a shot. From there, Craig would go inactive on the new original music side for an even lengthier period of time, but in 2015 he broke his hiatus with a full album teaming up with producer Green Velvet. I'm not really familiar with Green Velvet's work, so I wouldn't be able to analyze the specifics of how this collaboration came together. I did see a Discogs comment describing it as Green Velvet's compositional style with Carl Craig sound design. I guess we can go with that, I don't know. Anyway, this is a collection of very rigid and stripped back old school minimal techno bangers that don't have much to them beyond fairly standard but easily danceable techno beat frameworks, and some occasional repeated and vocoded spoken refrains acting as decently catchy hooks. While this is nothing mind-blowing by the standards of this genre, it's all an easily likable and fun time for what it is. Worth hearing for the track Murder of the Innocent, if absolutely nothing else. That one really went off. And 2 years after that, Craig came back with an album working with a full live orchestra, making his equivalent to what Jeff Mills did with his Blue Potential album a decade prior, primarily centered around remakes of his old tunes such as Atlas, Technology, Desire, Sandstorms, and others, combining bombastic orchestral arrangements with techno beats, but also peppered with small original compositions, mostly acting as interludes. I suppose I'd get it if some people heard this and found it to be a bit much, but I am always going to be a super easy sell for this exact kind of electronic orchestral crossover, and the way these arrangements are so heavily intensified give them a totally separate appeal from the originals, retaining the core danceability of the grooves while hyping them up to new unforeseen levels. Like, holy fuck does this version of Atlas go hard. I don't know, not much else to say besides I thought this was great. Finally, as of now, the most recent album-length project to come out of Craig just earlier this year. Well, technically this material isn't actually brand new. This project was originally released as like a bonus third disc to add onto a double CD DJ mix he put out in 2013 called Masterpiece, which mostly compiled together like various tracks from other artists who inspired him. Although that project never saw a digital release and is relatively hard to find, so I guess he decided to just put the disc of entirely original material out as a standalone project to make it more easily accessible 13 years after the fact. This was technically advertised as a collection of 6 extended beatless jams, although, again, they're not actually all beatless. This stuff mostly sticks to the classic techno sound palette you'd probably already expect out of Craig, with arrangements that happen to be at a slower tempo and more structurally open-ended than his usual fare. And it still works well as a mainline Carl Craig album. The 6 tracks here all create solid, dark, down-tempo grooves with neat progressions and evolutions over time. And the 6 tracks all have their own distinct identities, too. The first one has lots of mysterious nocturnal bass stabs and creeping rhythms. The second one has the most actual beats with mildly psychedelic droning pads to join it. The third one starts out with a super minimal and empty mix of eerie electric piano and synth riffs, but builds on plenty more layers of sounds over time. The fourth one joins super light plastic guitar synth sounds with some more driving bass pulsations and synthwave-like pads for possibly the album's best melodies. The fifth one gets surprisingly jazzy in its mix of more live-sounding drumming going up next to more electric pianos and weird bass drones. And the last one is pretty much just like a 7-minute single-note drone of super low and airy sub-bass with like a section of experimental ambient effects at the very beginning and some more at the end. Not the most interesting way for the project to go out, but there's still a lot of cool stuff here. Very good album overall and worth giving a shot if you missed it. So there we go. That's all I have to say about the discography of Carl Craig. I may have been really late to the bandwagon on this guy, but I can pretty much confirm the usual level of hype that gets thrown his way. Guy has definitely made a number of all-timers that I can easily see myself keeping around. My personal favorites were probably the Paperclip People album, and of course more songs about food and revolutionary art. And I don't think there were any outright duds I came across in his catalog either. Maybe the Landcruising remake felt redundant and unnecessary, and some of those comps had, like, their less interesting moments. But that's about as bad as it got. This guy's really consistent, despite his, his release schedule not being very consistent. If there's any, like, essential smaller one-off stuff this roundup may have skipped over, feel free to yell at me about what I might be missing out on, though hopefully this should still work well for someone who might have been interested in the guy's work in passing and didn't know where to start. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. More videos on the way soon. I am currently working on finally finishing up that freaking Amon Tobin series I started over a full year ago now, doing the odds and ends, which has been in fairly troubled development, as most of my videos in that particular format tend to be, but hopefully you'll get to see that sooner rather than later. Really need to just shut the lid on that series so I can move on to other things, but whatever. In the meantime, of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. The request schedule is still open. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.